Wuchang Fallen Feathers is yet another Souls-like. And if that sentence doesn't make you immediately think of Souls fatigue, then well, you're certainly among friends here. And to the point of this new, Chinese-developed Souls-like, there's actually a lot of interesting things to look at, dissect, and appreciate. But before we get into all of that and the details, there is this one thing. As with any Souls-like, with the adoption of the Souls formula comes the classic problem that all games inspired by From Software's Soulsborne games tend to run into. It's really a two-pronged challenge of not only nailing the essence of what makes From Software's Soulsborne games so good, but there's the need to also innovate and differentiate the game from not only the inspiration itself, but an increasingly packed and crowded list of other imitators and inspired games. And in 2025, where Wuchang Fallen Feathers makes its debut, there have already, up to this point, been a ton of games that have not only met this challenge, but exceeded expectations in a lot of ways. Games like Nioh 2, Lies of P, and the first Berserker Kazan, to name a few. Now, interestingly, Wuchang Fallen Feathers takes an entirely unique and different approach from both its contemporaries and the overall competition. The game focuses not on pushing the envelope or on reinventing or remixing the genre as a whole, but rather it actually takes the older aspects of the genre's origins from games like Dark Souls 1 and Bloodborne, and doubles down on bringing their design philosophies back to the forefront. There's no big shift to combat, there's no huge or impressive changes to storytelling, or even quest progression. Everything is kind of standard and pretty much what you'd expect from a game in this genre. What does stand out though, is in how the game focuses on really executing on the classic Souls style of exploration, level design, side quests, and in how the game tells its story as well. Everything is steeped in the obscure and ambiguous design philosophy that made so many people so enamored with From Software's earliest games. And as From Software, and really most of the other developers in this Souls genre, have sort of moved on and expanded upon that original design, making it more accessible or more approachable, there is a huge swath of fans that do miss the days when these games required a bit more attention, dedication, and investment to properly enjoy and experience. Thus, Wuchang Fallen Feathers is a game that will appeal the most to those fans. The fans that miss that labyrinthian, interconnected world design from Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3, as well as Bloodborne and Sekiro. It's also for those fans that loved digging through the item descriptions, notes, and combining all of that with the obtuse NPC Questlines to ultimately piece together the story and the narrative of these games. For everyone else, Wuchang will sit somewhere between an interesting but fairly standard Souls-like that has a unique Chinese cultural flavor to it with the characters and the world building, and a game that may end up frustrating with what may seem like archaic design elements and some seemingly rookie mistakes when it comes to the game's balancing and overall design. So, let's dive into all of that. Let's explore a game with three rather interesting sides to it. There's the stuff that's easy to appreciate and enjoy, there's the stuff that's very nostalgic for both good and bad, and then there's also the controversial changes and the rougher bits as well. All of that wrapped up in what is the first true Souls-like developed in China, from a relatively new developer in Lizhen Games, called Wuchang Fallen Feathers. A bit of a warning before we begin. This video will contain minor spoilers for Wuchang Fallen Feathers. I'll be showing some bosses, talking about some minor story elements. So, if you haven't played the game yet and want to go in blind, then as always, viewer discretion is advised here. Okay, so the first thing that I think is the most striking about Wuchang is its world and level design. Wuchang, as we alluded to earlier, focuses in on the idea of an interconnected series of labyrinthian zones. It's very reminiscent of the design that From Software used to employ in their games before they shifted to the open world with Elden Ring. It's that idea of going through a world that interconnects and loops back onto itself from multiple directions via shortcuts and hidden side paths. And Wuchang really goes to town on this idea. The first zone, for instance, that you start off in is also where you will come back to near the end of the game. And as you progress, you'll have shortcuts from multiple different other zones that all lead back to the beginning. Then, you'll move on to unlock further side paths to new areas that will ultimately also connect back. And, to make matters even more interesting, Wuchang, much like the earlier From Software games, has a ton of optional side areas that you can easily miss if you're not actively exploring and trying to keep track of what you've seen and what you haven't. Forks in the proverbial road are pretty common, and each fork can lead to its own fork, compounding the possible directions you can go in at any moment to multiples. So, it's very much on the player to navigate Wuchang's interconnected game world and to both find and experience all it has to offer. Again, a lot of veteran Souls players will love this stuff. They will love the fact that there's a real sense of discovery and a real sense of getting lost in this world until you piece everything together, potentially figuring it all out after multiple playthroughs. And I get the appeal here, for sure. I loved Sekiro and the Dark Souls games just as much as the next person. But for me, and honestly for a lot of people who prefer to do one definitive playthrough, this sort of world design necessitates following some kind of guide in order to not miss out on or unintentionally avoid a lot of the content. To that end, as I played through Wuchang, I found myself feeling both nostalgic and kind of appreciating the advances that we've had in both the Soulsborne and Souls-like games that we have today. As someone who doesn't generally replay games multiple times and tends to go for that definitive single playthrough, Wuchang's design and the easy-to-miss areas were kind of frustrating just as much as they were nostalgic. Yeah, it's really cool when you go to Kinehurst Castle in Bloodborne, for instance. But if you were not following a guide in those days, then you likely missed out on it in your first playthrough. Now, Wuchang is never that obtuse in terms of the side optional areas that it has, but it is easy to still miss certain locations and bosses if you don't either consult a guide or really make sure you go through all possible paths before you take down one of the game's story bosses and progress the main campaign. Much like any other classic Souls game, Wuchang's world will change and the overall story will advance when you face and defeat certain key bosses. And if you're not paying attention to the story, then it's quite easy to end up advancing said story and potentially locking yourself out of areas and NPC questlines. Again, this used to be pretty standard fare in the old days, especially where certain questlines and NPCs were instrumental in how the story and your potential ending would unfold. And Wuchang does actually tie its 4 endings to various NPC questlines and decisions that you make inside of them, combined with some optional hidden areas as well. But, interestingly, one aspect where Wuchang does kind of pull from the more recent advancements in the genre is in how it shows you what NPCs have active quests open that you can accomplish and where they are in the game's fast travel menu. This is something that Lies of P did quite well, allowing you to constantly be aware of what is left for you to do. The compromise here is that Wuchang only gives you these NPC indicators if you've started their questlines and talked to them for the first time. And speaking of NPC questlines and the story, Wuchang very much features a story that's meant to be pieced together in the sort of archaeological fashion that Miyazaki and From Software's earlier games tended to have. Unless you pay attention to each little piece of NPC dialogue, go out of your way to both talk to them and read the item descriptions of various items in the game, then you're likely going to have trouble following what's going on. And if that weren't enough, one aspect where Wuchang Fallen Feathers complicates matters a bit further is in how it bases its story and world on real Chinese history. The Chinese history angle is something that has actually caused both the game's development team and its most loyal fans some serious grief. Shortly after the game's release, there was this whole controversy in China with how the game depicted a certain part of Chinese history and a ruling dynasty known as the Ming Dynasty. The relation to not only actual historical figures, but a rather messy part of Chinese history and culture ultimately invited backlash in the developers' home country of China, and forced them to make some rather weird changes. After an update to the game, certain bosses and characters would not die after being beaten, and would either lie unconscious or just stand around awkwardly. And if that weren't enough, certain zones in the game, entire areas which had soldier enemies from the Ming's army, were sanitized to ultimately be non-confrontational NPCs. The changes ultimately didn't fare that great in terms of both reception from fans and the detractors of the game, and led to a watered-down experience of what was really a fictional and interesting alternate history fantasy take that sprung from real Chinese history. The choice to not only incorporate but touch on its own culture feels like one of those rookie mistakes that I mentioned at the beginning of this video. It's also likely why From Software avoided referencing actual history and the common real world until Sekiro. For their first game, Lee Zhen swung for the fences, but obviously weren't equipped to deal with the controversy and the reception to this sort of story. As for the story itself, honestly, it's hard to follow for anyone who's used to the more straightforward storytelling of not only games like Lies of P, but even From Software's more recent titles like Elden Ring and its Shadow of the Erdtree DLC. See, From Software did this really interesting thing with Elden Ring and its story, where they kept the depth and discovery that players would get from the sort of archaeological digging in terms of item descriptions and whatnot, but they also added a more accessible, straightforward layer on top for the more casual fan. The main core stories of games like Sekiro and Elden Ring are fairly easy to grasp and understand, and you can use just the cutscenes and the quest dialogue to get the gist of it. You know what you're supposed to do, you know your role in the story, and even some of the NPC questlines are actually fairly easy to understand and appreciate by themselves. How it all ties together and what the larger history of the world itself is, well, that's where the item descriptions and the digging and the archaeology comes in. And so, Wuchang definitely does channel the original Souls games that didn't have this two-tiered approach to storytelling. Thus, for me, as someone who doesn't dig deep enough in these games on his own and relies on either the surface level storytelling or lore videos after I've beaten the game, I can definitely attest to the obtuseness of the game's story. I've got a really funny example actually, in that I completely missed who the final boss of the game actually was. The final boss, depending on if you make it to the game's 5th chapter, is actually one of the NPCs that you encounter fairly early in the game. Said NPC has an entire questline that spans most of the game, and one of your decisions in his questline is what determines whether you get one of the game's 2 good endings or the bad one. And yet, I never computed, even while doing his questline, that he was eventually the one that transformed into the final boss. Is that on me? Probably. But the game also did make it fairly easy to miss that rather key particular detail. Having said that, of course, story is rarely the sole reason for why most people will play Soulslikes. Beyond the exploration, which Wuchang both nails and feels a bit archaic for, there's obviously the combat. And here, I think there's really not much of note to examine or say. Wuchang has a pretty solid, passable combat system. There's your standard health and stamina bar, and a shared Sky Might meter that allows you to both cast spells and use the weapon skills similar to how FP works in Elden Ring. The interesting thing here is that Skyborn Might is something that you can get one of 2 ways, which is either by unlocking specific passives for your weapons, or by perfect dodging. This system adds a sort of interesting dimension to the game, where playing well and using your weapon build properly is what contributes to your ultimate success and ability to use your most powerful tools. The caveat being that both your magic attacks and your weapon skills consume the same resource. So, based on your build, you'll either focus in on or have to pick and choose which of the 2 things you end up using while you're in the game's various battles. And adding to this sort of double-edged system is the game's madness system. Madness is something that will build up every time you kill a human enemy, or every time you die and revive at a checkpoint. But madness isn't an entirely bad thing, since while it does increase the amount of damage you take, it also increases your attack power, and if you have the right passives unlocked in the game's upgrade tree, it will also give you a ton of passive benefits as well. Beyond that, the Madness system or the Skyborn Might system don't really affect the game in a meaningful way, like say the World Tendency system in Demon Souls or the Humanity Hollowing system in some of the Dark Souls games. The idea here is that both Madness and Skyborn Might are supposed to have this sort of player choice and risk and reward system. And it's a neat idea, one that leaves it to the player to decide what kind of playstyle they're going for. But again, these systems, probably due to the rookie nature of the development team, tend to generally be useful in a very specific way. For Madness, for instance, it's always better to have it maxed out, as it not only gives you huge damage buffs and great passive abilities for bosses, but it even gives you a red mercury bonus in the game's more general dungeon areas when fighting normal enemies. Red mercury, of course, being the game's souls or upgrade currency that you use to level up. So it's always handy to have as much of that as possible and therefore be at max madness. There is one final thing in the madness system, which is where you can ultimately lose all your red mercury upon death if you're at max madness. And then, picking up said mercury becomes a bit more challenging, because if you die at max madness, wherever you die, unless it's a boss, that place of your death doesn't have the normal puddle of your dropped mercury. Instead, you end up fighting this enemy called a madness demon that basically serves as a mini-boss that has all your weapon attacks and can cast any spells and abilities that you have at your disposal. These enemies can be tough to fight until you realize that they can fight anything and everything around them. And here, you can actually use them to take down challenging enemies or areas by summoning them and then running away. So yeah, madness is this weird system, and it's a system that seems to have more reward than risk, which ultimately is an indication of the game's overall difficulty. Wuchang, for the most part, is not a hard game. It's got a few difficult enemies here and there, and some bosses are a bit unbalanced, but generally, the game gives you enough tools and power to basically make your way through it effortlessly. The one exception to that rather easy difficulty curve is in very specific bosses, namely a boss known as Honglan that you face twice, as well as the game's final 2 to 3 bosses as well. These bosses are notable in that they have a ton of mobility, will spam long attack strings, and seem to have infinite stamina with really small openings. And for some of them, they have what are called martial arts attacks. See, with the game's many weapons, there's these concepts of either parrying or clashing. Doing either is only possible on weapon attacks, with the idea being that you can't parry or clash every attack, forcing you to have to dodge certain attacks while clash and parry others. The problem with Honglan and some of the bosses like the Demon of Madness and the Demon of Obsession and the final boss is that they have more martial arts attacks and magic attacks than they do weapon ones. So, if you're using a weapon that primarily focuses on clashing or using parries, then these bosses not only become progression walls, but can easily be the most frustrating things you've ever played in a Soulslike. And the solution to these progression walls is to either really get good at dodging most of their moves and getting lucky enough to use your clash or parry abilities, or, more likely, you end up having to switch up your build. To that end, Wuchang does allow you, much like the first Berserker Kazan did earlier this year, to respec your character at any time without any cost. So, if you're one of those players that loves switching builds and min-maxing abilities based on each boss or each challenge that you come across, then Wuchang definitely facilitates that. But for those of us who love to really stick to and master a particular build, Wuchang will definitely frustrate and force you to abandon that particular playstyle. I, for instance, started off with the one-handed sword and a magic build, before ultimately switching over to the dual blades and playing primarily with a clash build. The dual blades and the clash build is pretty darn strong, especially if you use something like Leech and a weapon skill known as Blade Master to restore your health. But these weapons are completely useless against the aforementioned bosses, and while I pushed my way through both fights with Honglan and the Demon of Madness, I ultimately had to switch to the spear to defeat the last 2 bosses in the Demon of Obsession and the final boss. So, ultimately, Wuchang's combat is a bit of a mixed bag. There's quite the build variety with the game's 5 weapon types, and each weapon does have its own playstyle and feel, but you will ultimately have to switch between certain weapons if you want to progress through the game's content smoothly. And speaking of switching and progression, there's another interesting thing about Wuchang's combat and exploration, and that's in the game's status effects. Simply put, each of the game's various locations and zones that you explore will be littered with a bunch of nasty status effects and things that inflict those on you. There's your standard poison, which is known as corruption, but there's nastier stuff like blight, freeze, fire, and the dreaded despair status effect that can basically insta-kill you as soon as it procs. So, the solution here is to use and frequently switch out your armor sets. Armor set switching in this game is essential because not only will certain zones have tons of status effect buildup in the area itself, but even certain bosses will inflict status effects pretty easily, unless you have the corresponding armor that provides a significant resistance to said status effect. So basically, that dreaded swamp area that people hated in every Dark Souls game is more or less present in every area of the game. Thus, the status effectiveness of the game's overall combat and exploration is something that I think does artificially expand and lengthen the game a bit. You can certainly mitigate it, but the extreme focus on these status effects and constantly dealing with them can make certain zones a bit frustrating, as you're frequently trading physical defense for either ailment resistance or magic resistance. It's an interesting trifecta of magic, physical, and ailment, but more often than not, given how overwhelming one of these three can be in a particular area or with a particular boss, your choices are actually fairly limited. Again, it's another system that feels a bit underbaked and points to the relevant lack of experience by the game's development team. And while we're on the topic of underbaked, one final thing that's worth touching on is the presentation and the performance. Here, I think Leeson took a bit too much inspiration from Software, as the game's performance to visuals balance is pretty much exactly what From Software has been doing for a good while now. I mentioned it in my Shadow of the Erdtree video, but it's always a bit disappointing when a game that's got such interesting and deep combat mechanics tends to buckle in terms of giving you a stable frame rate and good performance. For Wuchang, the issue here is less so in the performance being bad, as the game does generally keep a stable or at least perceptively fluid frame rate in its performance mode, but it looks pretty darn ugly at times. In order to keep things moving smoothly, Wuchang goes the dynamic resolution route, which basically means that it'll sacrifice resolution and picture quality to keep the frame rate going at a constant rate. The end result is a game that looks like a pixelated mess in some of its most intense and demanding boss fights, where particle effects and gorgeous visuals end up looking like someone is trying to censor the picture on an old CRT TV broadcast. It's not great, particularly on console and lower-end PCs, which just points to another aspect of just how green of a development team Leeson really is. It's equally unfortunate when comparing it against things like Night Rain, which is a multiplayer Souls game, or even the more recent Lies of P DLC, and of course, this year's earlier, the first Berserker Kazan. Hopefully, if Leeson continues to make Souls-likes like this, then they get the performance to visual ratio figured out a bit, especially as they seem to have a really talented art and animation team that honestly deserves a bit more in the performance department. So, in the end, given all of that, all the callbacks to the more classic Souls formula, which can be both a pro or a con, the weird changes to the game's story, and the uneven combat system that mostly teeters on capable and easy, is Wuchang Fallen Feathers a game that is worth praising and lauding. Well, honestly, while there's a lot to like here, I don't believe that Wuchang Fallen Feathers is a game that we should be holding up as the gold standard for Souls games and Souls-likes moving forward. While I can appreciate the execution of the old style of Souls design, I personally think, as someone who explores a lot of these games and their design, that the old style has been let go for a reason. The labyrinthian level design, the obtuse storytelling, and the potential to miss out on huge swaths of content is really not something that I think we need in most of our Souls games. It's going to be a matter of opinion, of course, but the reason I liked the earlier From Software games had less to do with these aspects, and more to do with their excellent balancing, the boss design, the art direction, the atmosphere, and the rewards that we got for exploring these worlds. Wuchang Fallen Feathers is a game that's worth playing. It is enjoyable, and it's a nice trip down memory lane as well. But it also, in doubling down on the past, kind of exposes itself to being a lesser experience than a lot of the newer Soulsborne and Souls-like games we have today. I don't believe, therefore, that Wuchang is as good as, say, Lies of P or even the first Berserker Kazan, which both innovate and add a ton of new things to the classic formula. Instead, I liken Wuchang to Souls-like comfort food. It's certainly familiar, but it's not that deep in terms of flavor, and the texture can be a bit uneven, but it still feels good and enjoyable to eat. Also, I will say that as a first-time attempt from a new studio and a studio from a location that typically doesn't even make that many single-player games, let alone mechanically complex Souls-likes, there's a lot to be impressed by. Wuchang may not be one of the greatest Souls-likes for everyone, but it's certainly at least better than a lot of the more lower-tier games in this genre. And, in the end, I'd love to hear what you thought of Wuchang and of all this analysis. Was the trip down memory lane more meaningful for you than it was for me? Was it frustrating? And do you want more games to go back to this style of game design, or do you appreciate the newer advancements that we've seen lately? Please feel free to not only leave a comment below, but please like the video and subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll hopefully see you in the comment section below, or maybe in the next video.